My name is Josh Fulton. So, the topic of this mini lecture is American history 1865 to 1900. And this being a mini lecture, and that being a fairly big, broad topic, we're just going to kind of talk about five big things to be thinking about if you were a young adult, let's say in America in 1865, and you were a bit older by the time 1900 rolled around and you were still alive. What would be kind of examples of things that potentially would affect your life? So, or that of your family. So the first thing would be legacies of the Civil War. So in 1865, the U.S. has a terrible, brutal conflict come to an end where at least 600,000 people in a nation of 30 million had died, potentially many more, where we don't know where at least half the bodies are buried for these individuals. So it's brutal. Where 1865, 1866 is a period in which individuals are returning home, where communities are attempting to rebuild. So you're going to see this. You're going to see post-war veterans organizations from the Grand Army of the Republic in the U.S., and then, of course, in the former Confederate states, you're going to have the United Confederate Veterans, and then eventually the daughters, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy, right? This United Daughters of the Confederacy, this kind of thing. These kinds of organizations. You're going to have monuments put up. And there's lots of dialogue, of course, over the creation and advancement of the Lost Cause movement, which is going to happen during this time period as well, with a lot of this for the southern side. So not only are you going to have legacies of this war, and of course, just returning veterans, all this, is you're going to have Reconstruction, right? Reconstruction. So in 1865, you have the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. You have Andrew Johnson, who becomes the President of the United States. You have initial presidential efforts at Reconstruction begun by Lincoln initially, and then carried on by Johnson. You have the attempted impeachment of Johnson, and then you eventually have what's termed radical Reconstruction. You have the influence of agencies like the Freedmen's Bureau. You're going to have violence on the part of former Confederates who will attempt to resist the results of the war, of the 13th Amendment, freeing formerly enslaved people, and the 14th Amendment, which is actively working to attempt to legislate forms of equality. You're going to have the rise and growth of the KKK and efforts to stop their expansion and the power that they were enacting in the late 1860s and the early 1870s. You're going to have Reconstruction legislation. You're going to have opposition to that, and you're going to have millions of formerly enslaved people who are looking to be able to move off of spaces under which they had been enslaved, to connect with family and to attempt to build lives in spaces and places where many will be assaulted and face mistreatment and terror. So Reconstruction, although from a legal standpoint, most sort of survey texts and classes usually tend to place Reconstruction as ending in around 1877, after the election of 1876 and the pulling out of U.S. troops from the South. There are many scholars, of course, who look at Reconstruction as the idea of ongoing or unfinished or many Reconstruction, like that kind of thing. There's a lot of different ways or dates to look at that. But you have Reconstruction efforts ongoing here, certainly. And by the time you get to the 1890s, the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which allows in its ruling for the legal institutions of racial segregation and forms of segregation as well. So this is, of course, going to be another part of this. Another thing that, or big topic or theme that someone may have experienced if they were living in this time period is, of course, going to be conflicts and issues as it relates to indigenous peoples. So you're going to have Western expansionism. You're going to have the brutal wars against tribal communities that are going to occur throughout the 1860s, the 1870s, and beyond. Many tribal communities will fight back, but will struggle in these efforts as U.S. forces will engage in brutal crackdowns and in some cases, in brutal violence against them. And by the time you get to the 1880s, 1890s, many of the reservations and spaces that had been allowed under treaty are going to be broken down. You're going to see the enactment of what's called the Dawes Severalty Act, which is going to work to destroy tribal sovereignty. You're going to have the massacre at Wounded Knee occur. So you're going to have the process of the destruction of many tribal communities. You're going to have efforts on the part of many members of tribal communities to assert themselves. You're going to have violence against those communities. And you're also going to have Western expansionism of the role of rail, the creation of industries in the West and communities in the West, and conflict there. One of the other major things that you're going to see, certainly during this time, is another industrial revolution or another industrial age. So the U.S. is going to have an industrial revolution or industrial effort in the generation prior to the American Civil War. They're going to have another one after it. The one after it, so from the 1860s, 70s to about the 1880s, 90s, this is going to have a fairly significant effect on reshaping the nature of American society. America is decidedly a rural nation at the beginning of the 1800s. By the time you get to 1920, there are more Americans living in urban areas than there are living in rural areas. The Industrial Revolution is going to have a lot to do with this. You're going to see the process of mechanization of many forms of production that is going to transform not only the consumer goods, of course, that individuals are going to have access to and they're going to purchase in the forms of new technologies, but also, again, just the nature of work for many across the U.S. Be they any individual. The nature of what Americans understood work to be at the beginning of the century, and then by the time you get to the end of the 1800s, for many individuals is going to be different in terms of large-scale factory settings where many individuals feel that a sense of agency or a sense of control over their nature of the work that they are involved in is fundamentally being lost. Now, one of the other things that if you were living in America between 1865 and 1900 that someone potentially is going to see or to experience is also going to be the immigration. So America really is transforming in this time period. There is forms of immigration restriction that occur, particularly with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the early 1880s. But largely you're going to see from really the 1880s and the 1890s is the transformation of urban spaces, particularly cities like New York and Boston and Chicago and others, that you will see the influx of immigrant communities from all over the world, but particularly from across Europe at this time. Now, there would be forms of discrimination and restriction here, which is why you end up seeing a series of immigrant community enclaves, which are organized across a wide variety of ways. Race certainly, and ethnicity and this kind of thing have a role to play in these, and again, discrimination has a role to play in these. But the transformation of these spaces and the role of immigrants really is going to be central to understanding much of life in America, the lived experiences of life in America by the time you get to the early 1900s. Urbanization certainly would be another. So again, that idea of the growth of cities. A city like Chicago, for example, by the time you get to about 1860, is got about 100,000 people or so, right, give or take. And by the time you get to 1900, it's a lot more than that. And of course, with that comes, new technologies and transformation of space and structure of community and this kind of thing, and urban planning and all of this. So, from the legacies of the Civil War, Reconstruction, indigenous communities and tribal community experiences, to immigration and urbanization, and there's a lot going on in America between 1865 and 1900. Thank you.